The roses at Ashworth Estate bloomed every September as if by royal command, and perhaps the servants whispered they did. Lady Eleanor Ashworth, Duchess of Ashworth, had a way of imposing her will upon everything within her domain, and the grounds were no exception. Even nature, it seemed, did not dare disappoint her. She stood at the tall window of her morning room on the first day of autumn, 1903, dressed in a gown of deep burgundy that cost more than most men in Yorkshire earned in a year. Her dark hair was pinned with the precision of a woman who believed that disorder, in any form, was a moral failing. She was 26 years old and already a widow, already a legend, and already feared by nearly everyone who had the misfortune of working beneath her roof. "Mrs. Pemberton," she said, without turning from the window. The housekeeper appeared in the doorway instantly. "Yes, Your Grace." "The east corridor smells of candle smoke. It has smelled of candle smoke for 3 days. I should not have to mention it a second time, let alone a third." "I will see to it immediately, Your Grace." "You will see to it now." Mrs. Pemberton disappeared without another word. Eleanor turned back to the grounds below. 32 servants lived and worked at Ashworth Estate. She knew each of their positions, each of their wages, and each of their most recent failings. She did not know many of their names. Names, she had always believed, encouraged familiarity, and familiarity was the beginning of disorder. Her late husband, the Duke of Ashworth, had died 18 months prior, a quiet gray man who had spoken to her mostly in formal sentences and left her mostly alone. Their marriage had been arranged when she was 19, executed with all the warmth of a business contract, and mourned by Eleanor not at all. She had inherited the estate, the title and courtesy, the fortune and the freedom. Of these 4 things, she valued the freedom most. What she had never inherited, what no one had thought to give her, was kindness. The autumn garden party at Ashworth Estate was among the most anticipated events in Yorkshire society. 60 guests arrived on the 14th of September in polished carriages, adorned in their finest, eager for Eleanor's legendary hospitality, the food, the wine, the grounds in their amber glory, and, if they were honest, the spectacle of Eleanor herself. She did not disappoint. She moved through her guests like a queen reviewing her court, exchanging pleasantries with precision and compliments with economy. She smiled when protocol required it and withheld warmth as a matter of principle. It was just past 3 in the afternoon when the incident occurred. A young servant boy, 14 years old, round-cheeked, recently hired, was carrying a silver tray of champagne glasses across the stone terrace. Whether from nerves or the uneven paving, his foot caught, and the tray tilted. 2 glasses slid, one shattered on the stone. The garden fell quiet the way gardens do when something irreversible has happened. Every guest turned. The boy froze, his face draining of color, his eyes wide with the particular terror of the powerless. Eleanor crossed the terrace in 6 measured steps. "What is your name?" she asked, her voice carrying clearly across the silence. "W. William, Your Grace," the boy whispered. "William." She looked down at the shattered glass, then back at the boy with an expression colder than the autumn air. "I see that you have managed, in the space of 1 afternoon, to humiliate yourself, embarrass this household, and ruin the composure of 60 guests. Tell me, is incompetence something you practiced, or does it come to you naturally?" A few guests shifted uncomfortably. No one spoke. "You will clean this up," Eleanor continued, loud enough for all to hear, "and then you will present yourself to Mrs. Pemberton, who will discuss whether someone of your particular aptitude is suited to employment at Ashworth at all." The boy's lip trembled. He knelt and began gathering the broken glass with shaking hands. Eleanor turned back to her guests with a composed smile. "Forgive the interruption," she said smoothly. "More champagne will be brought directly." The party resumed. The boy was not seen again that afternoon. What Eleanor did not know, could not have anticipated, was that standing near the garden wall, half concealed by an arrangement of late-blooming hydrangeas, stood a man who had witnessed every word. He was broad-shouldered, silver-haired, and still as stone. Lord Edmund Harrington, Duke of the Northern Counties, personal confidant of King Edward III's inner council, and the great uncle of young William. The letter arrived 11 days later, delivered by a king's messenger on a grey Tuesday morning. It was not the first letter of its kind Eleanor had received. Over the past 2 years there had been quiet notes from acquaintances, polite withdrawals from social engagements, and once, a carefully worded correspondence from a countess suggesting that Eleanor's management style had become a subject of unfortunate discussion. Eleanor had ignored them all. This letter she could not ignore. She was summoned to a private council in London, not a public court, which would have been a mercy, but something smaller and therefore more suffocating. 7 men seated around a mahogany table in a Whitehall chamber, Lord Harrington among them, his expression carrying the satisfaction of a man who had waited patiently for justice. The council was brief. Her conduct was documented. Her history of cruelties to staff, to tradespeople, to those who had no recourse, was laid before her in quiet, devastating detail. "Your Grace," the council chairman said at last, "it has been determined that correction is required, not merely financial penalty which you could absorb without consequence, something that will teach what wealth has failed to." Eleanor sat very still. "You will marry," he continued, "Mr. Thomas Hale, head groundskeeper of Ashworth Estate, a man of common birth and honest character. The marriage will be legally binding and publicly recorded." The room was silent. Eleanor felt the blood leave her face. "That is," she said slowly, "absolutely impossible." "It is, Your Grace, absolutely decided." She argued, she threatened. She invoked her late husband's name, her family's legacy, the absurdity of the decree. The 7 men listened with the patience of those who have already made up their minds. She returned to Ashworth Estate that evening in a closed carriage, the autumn darkness pressing against the windows, her hands folded in her lap so tightly her knuckles were white. Thomas Hale, a groundskeeper, her groundskeeper. Very well, she thought, her jaw tightening against the darkness. He would regret it far more than she would. Thomas Hale had been waking before dawn since the age of 9. It was not discipline that pulled him from sleep in those early hours. It was something quieter and harder to name. A relationship with the world before the world grew loud. He would walk the grounds of Ashworth Estate in the gray pre-morning light, checking the soil, reading the sky, listening to what the land required of him that day. The other servants found it unusual. Thomas found everything else unusual. He was 28 years old, lean and weather-worn, with hands that told the full story of his life without a single word. He had grown up the son of a Derbyshire farmer who died when Thomas was 16, leaving behind 3 acres of exhausted land and a shelf of books that Thomas had read so many times the spines had given up entirely. He had educated himself slowly and without ceremony: history, poetry, natural science, philosophy, absorbing knowledge the way his gardens absorbed rain, quietly and completely. He had come to Ashworth 5 years prior, recommended by a neighboring estate's head gardener, and had transformed the grounds from respectable to exceptional. Lord and Lady Ashworth in the Duke's final years had barely noticed. Eleanor had not noticed at all. To her, the grounds were simply correct, which was the highest praise she extended to anything functioning as it should. When Mrs. Pemberton had knocked on Thomas's cottage door on a Wednesday evening and told him, haltingly and with considerable distress, what had been decreed, Thomas had stood quietly for a long moment, looking past her at the darkening sky. "I see," he had said finally. Is that all you have to say, Mr. Hale?" "I'll need to think," he said. "Would you like some tea while I do?" He had thought through the night. By morning he had reached his conclusion. He had not asked for this. He did not want it. But Thomas Hale had never been a man who confused his circumstances with his character. What happened to him was not who he was. He met Eleanor in the main drawing-room 3 days before the legally mandated ceremony, her idea, summoned formally, as though he were still being called to account for improperly trimmed hedgerows. She sat in the high-backed chair nearest the window, dressed immaculately, her expression arranged into something between contempt and boredom. Thomas stood across from her and did not fidget. "I want you to understand," Alina began, "that this arrangement changes nothing in this household. You will continue your duties on the grounds. You will take your meals separately. You will not address me informally under any circumstances, and you will not." "I have one condition," Thomas said quietly. Alina stopped. People did not interrupt her. "I beg your pardon." "But one condition," he repeated without apology. "Treat me however you wish, say what you like. I will continue my work regardless." He held her gaze steadily. "But I will always treat you with respect. That is not negotiable, and it is not performance. It is simply who I am." Alina stared at him for a long moment, searching his face for sarcasm or strategy and finding neither. "Get out," she said. Thomas nodded once and left, and Alina sat alone in her chair for a long time after, unsettled by something she could not immediately identify. Alina conducted their marriage the way she conducted everything, as a campaign. She ensured Thomas was seated at the far end of any shared arrangement, spoke to him only through intermediaries when possible, and maintained in public the expression of a woman enduring a tiresome obligation with characteristic grace. She made cutting remarks at breakfast when proximity forced it. She questioned his judgment on estate decisions he had managed expertly for 5 years. She did it all with the refined precision of a woman who understood that cruelty dressed in composure was the most effective kind. Thomas did not break. He tended the grounds with the same unhurried devotion as always. He repaired the crumbling stone wall along the east garden, which 3 previous groundskeepers had left for later. He restored the neglected greenhouse at the property's north end, coaxing dormant plants back to life, with a patience that the other servants watched with quiet amazement. He learned without being asked that the cook's elderly father needed a particular herbal remedy unavailable in the village, and he grew it himself in a corner of the kitchen garden. The staff adored him. They had always respected him. Now they loved him in the uncomplicated way that people love those who treat them as fully human. Alina noticed all of it from a careful distance. One afternoon in late October, she stood at her bedroom window and watched Thomas cross the lower garden carrying something bundled carefully in his coat. He knelt near the old stone wall and set the bundle down with extraordinary gentleness. A fox, young, injured, its front leg held at a wrong angle, blinked up at him. Thomas spoke to it softly, something Alina could not hear through the glass, and began fashioning a careful support from materials he had apparently brought for exactly this purpose. Alina stood at the window far longer than she intended. Another morning, she passed the open door of the servants' hall and heard Thomas's voice, unhurried and warm, reading aloud from a book of poetry to a small group that included 2 housemaids, the stable boy and Mrs. Pemberton herself, who was pretending to mend a tablecloth while listening with complete attention. And then there was the afternoon she learned, entirely by accident, that Thomas had been quietly correcting people in the village who repeated the crueler gossip about her, not defensively, not with drama, simply and firmly redirecting the conversation toward decency. He was defending her. The man she had done nothing but demean was defending her reputation to strangers. Alina found this deeply inconvenient. The storm arrived on a Friday night without proper warning. Alina had walked to the old stone chapel at the property's edge that evening, a habit from her early widowhood, when the silence of the small building had offered something the grand house could not. She had not anticipated how quickly the sky would close. By the time the rain came, it came completely, and the chapel was her only shelter. She had been there 20 minutes, sitting rigid in the front pew, listening to the storm dismantle the world outside, when the chapel door opened and Thomas stepped in, soaked through, carrying a lantern. He saw her. She saw him. Neither spoke immediately. He set the lantern on the stone ledge, moved to a respectful distance, and sat down on the rearmost pew without a word, asking nothing. The storm pressed closer. The silence between them shifted gradually from cold to something else, something without a name in polite society. "Why did you come here?" Eleanor asked finally, not turning around. I saw the light, Thomas said simply. Another silence. I'm not what this parish thinks I am, Eleanor said, and was immediately surprised she had said it aloud. Thomas said nothing. He only listened, which was rarer and more valuable than most responses. I have been unkind, she continued, her voice dropping to something unfamiliar, unguarded, stripped of its armor. I have been unkind my entire adult life because it was the only power I was ever given, and I used it as though it were inexhaustible. She stopped. I did not know what else to do with it. The storm struck the chapel roof. My first marriage, she continued slowly, was arranged when I was 19. He was not cruel, he was simply absent. And I learned in that house that feeling anything openly was weakness, that needing anything from another person was dangerous, and that the safest position was always above, always looking down. She finally turned to look at him across the dim chapel. I have been looking down for so long I forgot there was anything worth seeing. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, My mother died when I was 11. I used to walk the fields at night because the house was too quiet to bear. He looked at the lantern light. I understand what a person does with grief when no one teaches them how to carry it. They sat together in the old chapel, while the storm spent itself outside, talking for the first time as two people with nothing left to perform. And something that had been locked for a very long time in Eleanor Ashworth's chest shifted quietly in the dark. The morning after the storm, Eleanor came downstairs before the household had properly risen. She found Mrs. Pemberton in the kitchen and said, without preamble, What is the name of the boy who assists in the scullery? The youngest one. Mrs. Pemberton blinked. That would be Peter, Your Grace, Peter Marsh. And the woman who tends the upstairs linen. Agnes Webb. Eleanor nodded slowly. I would like, she said carefully, a full list of the staff, their names, their positions, their years of service. Mrs. Pemberton stared. Today, please, Eleanor added and left the kitchen. She asked Thomas that same morning to walk the grounds with her. He agreed without comment, and they walked in the early November cold through the restored greenhouse, along the mended wall, past the corner of the kitchen garden where the herbs grew in careful rows. Thomas spoke about the land with quiet authority. Eleanor listened in a way she had not listened to anyone in years. It became a morning ritual. Neither announced it, neither named it. But every morning, as the winter light crept pale across the Yorkshire grounds, Eleanor and Thomas walked the estate together, their conversations growing longer, their silences growing warmer. It was not yet love, but it was the thaw that makes love possible, and after a winter as long as Eleanor's had been, it was extraordinary enough. Section 3. What a Duchess Must Learn to Deserve. London in December was a city that dressed its cruelty in candlelight. The gossip had begun quietly, the way most devastating things do, a whispered observation at a Mayfair dinner, a raised eyebrow at a theater interval, a carefully composed letter between two women who signed themselves as Eleanor's dearest friends. By the time it reached full voice, it had acquired all the embellishments that idle society requires. The Duchess of Ashworth, they said, had gone peculiar. She walked her grounds each morning with the groundskeeper as though they were equals. She had learned the servants' names. She had, someone claimed with particular horror, been seen laughing near the greenhouse. Lord Harrington, satisfied and watchful from his London townhouse, ensured the story traveled well. He added, through intermediaries, the clarification that no reversal of the decree would be pursued. The marriage was permanent. The Duchess was finished. She could keep her estate, her fortune, and her fallen reputation, and make the best of the remarkable life she had constructed for herself in Yorkshire with her gardener husband. The invitation that arrived in the second week of December was unexpected, and Eleanor understood immediately. A trap. Lady Constance Belmore, a woman Eleanor had once considered an ally, which in their world meant someone equally skilled at drawing blood politely, was hosting a winter dinner for 40 guests at her Kensington residence. The invitation was worded with perfect courtesy. Its intention was perfectly clear. Alina was being invited to be exhibited. She went anyway. She had never been a woman who refused a room. The evening began with careful pleasantries, the particular form of social violence in which everyone pretends nothing is happening while something terrible happens continuously. Former friends greeted her with smiles that did not reach their eyes. Acquaintances asked questions about Ashworth Estate with expressions of exaggerated sympathy. Lady Constance herself delivered the sharpest blow with the lightest touch, asking, in front of 12 seated guests, whether Alina found Yorkshire winters manageable, given the present domestic circumstances. The table waited. Alina opened her mouth and then stopped. Across the long dining room, near the entrance where late guests were being received, stood Thomas. He had come down on the afternoon train without telling her. He was dressed plainly, no title, no decoration, nothing that the room would recognize as rank, but he stood with the kind of stillness that does not require a title to command space. He had come because he had known she would be here. He had come because he understood, without being asked, that she should not be alone in this room. He met her eyes across the candlelight. Alina felt something she had not felt in 26 years of living in rooms exactly like this one. She felt chosen. The table was still waiting for her answer. Alina set down her wine glass with great care, the way a person sets something down when they have decided to stop carrying it. She looked at Lady Constance. She looked at the 12 faces arranged around the table in their winter finery, each one holding the particular expression of people who believe themselves to be watching a defeat. She stood up. "Forgive me," she said clearly, in the voice that had once commanded 60 guests across a garden terrace. "I find I need to say something that was not on this evening's program." The room went very quiet. "I was invited here," Alina continued, "because it was assumed that I would be diminished, that I would arrive embarrassed, perform gratitude for your tolerance, and confirm for your collective satisfaction that I have been appropriately ruined." She looked around the table without flinching. "I understand the assumption. I would have made it myself once." No one breathed. "My husband," she said, and let the word stand plainly without apology, "is the most honorable person in this room tonight. He is standing near the door if you would like to form your own opinion. He has no title. He has no estate. He has no family name that any of you would recognize." She paused. "He has, however, more integrity than I have encountered in 30 years of moving through rooms like this one. And he came here tonight, uninvited, unknown, and unannounced, simply to stand beside me." She looked at Lady Constance directly. "I did not come here to be managed. I came to tell you that I am not ashamed. I am, for the first time in my adult life, not remotely ashamed." She sat down. The silence lasted several long seconds. Then, from the far end of the table, an elderly woman in dove-gray silk, the Dowager Countess of Selborne, who had known Alina's father and was the closest thing the room contained to genuine moral authority, began, very deliberately, to applaud. It was not a roar. It was 4 or 5 pairs of hands, but in that room it was sufficient. 2 weeks later, Alina wrote to the King's Council. The letter was precise and uncharacteristic. She was not requesting the annulment of her marriage. She was requesting the formal recognition of her husband's dignity and service. She cited his 5 years of exceptional stewardship of Ashworth Estate. She cited his character, documented by every member of the estate staff in letters she had personally collected. She called in every remaining favor, every old loyalty, every connection her father's name still carried. She did it without telling Thomas. She did it entirely for him. The King's response arrived on the morning of the 20th of January, 1904. Thomas Hale was to be formally recognized as Sir Thomas Hale of Ashworth, an honorary designation carrying no lands and no inherited privilege, but carrying his name, recorded permanently in the rolls of the realm, above reproach and beyond the reach of gossip. The council noted in careful language that the character testimony submitted on his behalf was among the most comprehensive they had ever received. Alina read the letter at the breakfast table and then set it beside Thomas's teacup without a word. He read it. He was quiet for a long time. "You did this," he said finally. "You deserved it," Alina replied, in the matter-of-fact tone she now used for truths she had stopped being afraid of. Thomas looked at her across the breakfast table, across the ordinary geography of cups and morning light, and a shared life neither of them had expected. And something in his steady expression shifted into something she recognized now without difficulty. "Alina," he said quietly, which was still the only name he ever used for her, never Your Grace, never Duchess, always simply her name, which had always been the most radical thing about him. "Would you do something for me?" "That depends," she said, which made him smile. "Marry me again," he said, "properly, in the chapel, just us and the people who actually know us." Alina looked at him for a moment. Outside the breakfast room window, the January grounds of Ashworth Estate were bare and frost-white, waiting for spring. "I was rather thinking the same thing," she said. On the 1st of February, in the old stone chapel where the storm had first broken them both open, Alina and Thomas stood before Mrs. Pemberton and Agnes and Peter and the full household staff of Ashworth Estate and spoke vows that no council had written and no decree had required. Thomas promised to walk beside her always. Alina promised to keep learning how. The witnesses were not lords or ladies. They were people whose names Alina now knew completely, every one of them. Spring arrived at Ashworth Estate in the last week of March, as it always did, with a particular quality of light that turned the grounds golden in the early morning. Thomas was already outside when Alina came down, as he always was. She pulled her coat around her shoulders and crossed the dew-wet grass toward him, and he turned at the sound of her steps and waited, the way he had always waited, patient, steady, and entirely sure of her. They walked the grounds together as the sun climbed the Yorkshire sky, not a duchess and her groundskeeper, not a punishment and its subject, not a grand lesson arranged by kings and councils. Simply two people who had found, in the most unlikely arrangement imaginable, the one thing that neither rank nor ruin can manufacture. The one thing that has no title and needs none.